Hello, it's Chris here. And today, for discussion, I'm going to be talking about 3 short stories by Ambrose Bierce. Now, Ambrose Bierce, he was an American writer born in the 1840s, and he disappeared mysteriously around 1914. So he lived through the American Civil War, and he was actually a soldier enlisted in the Indiana regiment, a regiment in Indiana. So for the Union. And he's very much regarded as the Civil War writer, a writer who penned many stories and I believe also memoirs regarding the Civil War. He was a prolific writer and a journalist. I don't think he wrote any novels, but he wrote many short stories. He wrote The Devil's Dictionary, which is a very well work of American satire. One of the probably his best known single works. However, his short stories are also very highly regarded. And he has a significant legacy in American literature. I was first aware of Ambrose Bierce years ago when I read Robert Chambers's The King in Yellow, which is a horror collection of stories, a collection of short stories that all center around, gravitate around this figure of the King in Yellow. And this was written in the 1890s. But it turns out that Robert Chambers was very much influenced by Ambrose Bierce as well. So I became just aware of the name Ambrose Bierce and that he was quite a big figure in American literature. However, I never delved into reading any of his works until now. Turns out he's quite a big figure in American literature, but perhaps one that is not discussed as much as certain authors such as Hemingway, Mark Twain, the like. But these 3 stories that I read, they're from a collection of tales concerning soldiers. He has a collection of short stories which is titled Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, I believe. Although they get mixed in the bunch, and just because something is called Tales of Soldiers doesn't mean that it doesn't follow civilians as well. And the 3 stories I read were A Horseman in the Sky, An Occurrence at Owl Creek, and Chickamauga. Now, these are some of his best known stories. They're part of the collection of stories about soldiers. However, as I mentioned before, they're not all about soldiers. In fact, actually only one of them, the main character, the protagonist, is a soldier. The others, perhaps we could argue in a metaphorical or symbolic way, they are soldiers. Now, the first one, A Horseman, well, what unites these stories already? Just from these 3 stories, there is the idea of attacking the myth of glory that comes with war and violence. The mythology of war is such a great thing. All of these 3 stories, they do paint a rather grim, very much an anti-war picture to the events that Bierce is describing. Now, all 3 of these stories concern the Civil War, the American Civil War. A Horseman in the Sky concerns a West Virginian, a Virginian actually, who ends up enlisting in the Union rather than the Confederate Army. And his family, they are at least in the territory of the Confederacy. However, he elects to enlist for the Union, for the West Virginia regiment. And our character is found sleeping. Essentially, he's a scout, but he's sleeping, and he's described as being a criminal because what he's doing there is essentially a crime as far as martial law, to be asleep at your post, and he could be hanged for that if he was found. Yeah, and without going too in depth into that story, it's the story A Horseman in the Sky. It does concern the destructive effects of war on one's family and how obedience to your duty as a soldier can tear apart your family, destroy your family. An occurrence in Owl Creek is, so I'm not going to go much more in depth into A Horseman in the Sky, other than to say that an occurrence at Owl Creek, I perhaps will delve into spoilers later on, but it concerns, it basically posits the question that there isn't really any glory even in death when it comes to war. Whether you're a civilian or a soldier, there's not going to be glory. You're not going to be saved. Happy endings don't happen really in war. Chickamauga concerns a child, a 6-year-old child who sort of dreams, and he has a very simple mind, as all 6-year-olds have, and he dreams of war and fighting and adventure, and he has his own little sword, and he goes into the forest to play. However, he's confronted with the realities, the aftermath, essentially, of the Battle of Chickamauga, which was a very bloody battle in northern Georgia. I believe it was one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War after Gettysburg. And this child who's living in this, Ambrose Bierce writes it, so it's kind of uncertain what is happening to this child. It's through his perspective. But as it becomes clear that he's witnessing bloodied, wounded soldiers wounded figures, I should say, crawling through the forest, we come to realize that this is the site of a battle. This is a battle that is ending, and when battles end, very much they end in quite a lot of violence and carnage that happens to civilians around the area. Once military personnel get taken out, get killed, are fleeing, the ensuing areas where civilians are living, they also feel the brunt, the violence, the carnage of war. And in Chickamauga, it's quite beautiful, Bierce's perspective. The reason I mentioned soldiers and then relented later on to say soldiers is because Bierce does an excellent, he's excellent at keeping suspense in these events, and keeping the perspective of a certain character alive right until the end when it gets shattered. That's something that happens in all three of these stories, is the perspective of the main character is maintained for almost 90% of the narrative, but then at the end, that perspective collapses. More on an occurrence at Owl Creek. Our main character is a Southern sympathizer, and he has attempted to sabotage a Union railroad, which is a crime, obviously, to sabotage the transportation of goods on a Union railroad, and he is condemned to be hanged, and that's where our story starts, essentially. And as he's about to be hanged, he starts to think about his life, his family, and here's where the spoilers happen. He seems to escape this hanging. The platform breaks down. He goes into the creek. They're shooting at him. These grotesque figures are shooting at him. These Union soldiers are trying to kill him, but he escapes. He goes all the way down the bend, down the creek, and he's saved. He runs. He runs as fast as he can to his home. And right when he sees his wife and she embraces him, we're snapped back to reality. And it becomes known that he actually did die. He was hanged on that bridge. And I do recall in this story how we delude ourselves and how time perhaps warps into a small smidgen, a small sliver of time seems to become an eternity, a large, where we seem to live our lives, dream things up, hallucinate. I recall The Secret Miracle by Jorge Luis Borges, an almost exact similar story, but rather someone is found on the end of a firing squad, and time seems to slow down right as they're about to die. So in here we also see the glory, the escape. When it comes to war, this is not something that we can escape. Our characters don't escape it. Chickamauga, similarly in the end, when the child returns home, he finds that his home and his parents have been looking for him for so long. He's lost in the woods. As I mentioned, these grotesque figures are crawling. They're all injured, bloodied. I recall the painting of William Blake's painting on Nebuchadnezzar, the man who essentially turned into an animal in the Bible. I think it's Daniel's narrative. Nebuchadnezzar, who lost his wits and started crawling around. That famous painting by William Blake on Nebuchadnezzar. The man with the large beard, crawling with the very sullen, angsty face. I recall that, and that image came to my mind with the grotesque figures that are crawling through the forest, trying to flee the battle. And the child doesn't really know what this is. At first he thinks these are just African American servants and slaves, which he used to play with. But it becomes clear that this is a war. And the child, delusionally, in some ways, takes up this excitement that this is a war, this is an army, this is his army. And he goes with them and leads them out. But then when he returns home, he finds that his hamlet, his village, has been ransacked, and his mother essentially is dying right in front of him, crushing the myth of a glorious war, of war being something to glorify. So that's Ambrose Bierce. He has an excellent affinity for geography. I would actually say that's something to note. He describes places, their locations. You get really a sense of where you are as far as the territory, the location, the natural sights around you. You get a real good feeling of that in all three of these stories. This sense of the physical space that characters are inhabiting. But all three of these stories, they do sort of attack the myth of war as a glorious enterprise. And this is an author, I would presume, as I mentioned earlier on in the video, who is really the seminal, pivotal Civil War writer, a writer that really writes about the effects of the Civil War. Once again, a prolific writer. He was not just a journalist and a satirist, and not just someone who wrote about war, but also wrote about speculative fiction. His horror writings are quite well known as well. As I mentioned, Robert Chambers and Lovecraft subsequently are very influenced by this train of thought that he continues on, perhaps also inherited from Edgar Allan Poe. But that is Ambrose Bierce. Those are the 3 short stories I wanted to share with you guys. I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.